And then John turned to me and he said, "Tom, can you grow Sea Island cotton?" And I said, "I have absolutely no idea." So first things first, I want to talk about the purpose of this plot here on the Hutchinson House property. Sea Island cotton is absolutely integral. It is the core of the story of Henry Hutchinson. The wealth and the future that he secured for his family and the funds that he used to build this house was entirely through the growth of Sea Island cotton. Henry was born in 1860, the year of secession, and he was only 5 years old when the Civil War ended. He never knew Sea Island cotton as a crop grown by slaves. He knew it as a crop that his father grew and worked tirelessly to secure land for him and his neighbors in order to grow Sea Island cotton to secure a better future for him, his neighbors, and his family. And he sees that future wholly and fully through the growth of Sea Island cotton on his property, and he also worked as a broker for all of his neighbors and the other freedmen of the Casino Point, Shell House, Point of Pines communities, because he operated a cotton gin house next to his house, which has sadly been demolished, but we have found the nail field through archaeological research. And he processed and shipped the cotton to his factory in Charleston, and then divided the profits he returned respectively among his neighbors. And this allowed his neighbors to secure higher prices per pound of cotton than they would with white factors elsewhere on the island, because there was a prejudice against freedmen-grown cotton on the island. And by working directly with Henry through his factor, they were able to secure a much higher price per pound, and it really helped pave a brighter future for the freedmen communities surrounding the Hutchinson House, with Henry at the center. And the purpose for growing Sea Island cotton here on this plot is because it is just core to telling that story. The other purpose is that Sea Island cotton is one of the most historically important, in fact it is the most historically important plant in the history of the South. And up until just recently, it was thought entirely extinct. And so this plot is working to help secure a living seed bank for that crop so that we don't forget this part of our history. So I guess the first thing I can talk about with the biology of Sea Island cotton is how it's different from upland cotton. I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with upland cotton, which is grown throughout the Midlands of South Carolina. It's a very short, stocky plant, and it has bolls that look like this. They're very flat, wide, and fluffy. Sea Island cotton is actually a member of an entirely different species of cotton. It is a cultivar of long staple cotton, which is a tropical plant that was refined for millennia by the Native Americans of South America. And then when European settlers arrived, they furthered that refinement and took it to the Caribbean, where they grew it in tree cotton plantations. Long staple cotton is a tropical plant, and it's actually a perennial, and left alone to its own devices in the tropics, it grows into a small tree about the size of that pecan over there. And so they would come back, they would top it, and then come back year after year and pick the cotton from the tree. And it was grown as a perennial. And one of the interesting things about tropical plant biology is that in the tropics there's only 2 seasons. They don't have winter, spring, summer, and fall. They have dry and wet. So half of the year it's wet, and half of the year it's not so wet. And what complicated growing Sea Island cotton in the United States was that it's a long day flowering plant, which means it only flowers in winter. It flowers during the dry season in the tropics. It flowers whenever the days start to become shorter, whenever they're longer, which is in winter, when the axis of the earth tilts slightly and the days become a little longer. So when you bring Sea Island cotton, or when you bring long staple cotton to the United States, it's not Sea Island cotton yet, it grows and grows and grows and grows and looks like this, and it doesn't flower until this time of year. And it takes long staple cotton at least 8 weeks to reach maturity. So what would happen is you would bring long staple cotton to the United States, you would plant it, it would grow for 8 months, and it would bloom in October, and then it would get killed in the middle of December, and you would get no crop at all. You might get just enough to replant the following year, but you would not be able to make any sort of profit off of it. Well, that didn't stop people from continuing to try, and in the mid-1780s, or maybe I think it was the early 1780s, through a miracle of epigenetics, they had planted a field of long staple cotton on a sea island in Georgia, and they had an extremely mild winter that year. So mild, in fact, that the cotton actually regenerated from its roots across large swaths of the and it bloomed in spring that year. And they collected seeds from those plants. And just from some epigenetic factor in there that forced the plant to start blooming earlier, they were able to develop an early flowering, short day strain of long staple cotton, which then gave rise to Sea Island cotton. Sea Island cotton was then planted throughout the southeast. And I want to get into some of the little physiological differences between Sea Island cotton and upland cotton. One of the most striking differences is the fact that this is taller than I am. And upland cotton, as most of you are used to, is usually not any taller than this table. And that's the easiest way you can tell it apart. Another difference is that the flowers of Sea Island cotton are bright yellow. The flowers of upland cotton are usually white or slightly pinkish, maybe pastel yellow in a way. But Sea Island cotton is always bright sunflower, well, not quite sunflower yellow, but bright yellow. Usually a pastel to just pure yellow. Also, the leaves of long staple cotton are usually have 5 lobes, sometimes 7, sometimes 9. Upland cotton usually only has 3-lobed leaves. They sort of look like a maple leaf without any serrations. Whereas long staple cotton, it usually looks like a sweet gum leaf with even more lobes to it. Also, the bolls are different. Upland cotton has bolls that look like a little green ping pong ball, and they split apart and they produce these very flat, wide bolls. Long staple cotton has a bowl that looks like a green egg with a little point on the end. And when they open up, and these are not good examples, these are some of the early stuff I had that is not very nice looking. They sort of have a sort of winged appearance with a point of lint in the middle. That hints at the biggest difference between these, that really makes them into 2 vastly different crops. The thing with upland cotton is that, as you can see, it produces far, far, far more lint per bull than long staple cotton. But the difference is that the lint on this is only about 7/8 of an inch long, at its best. And that is what, this is a modern cultivar of upland cotton I stole from the side of the road in St. Matthews. But it has, and in the middle of these cotton bolls, or in the balls of the cotton itself, is a little tiny green seed that is absolutely hairy across the entirety of its surface. And down in here, in the middle of these long staple cotton balls, there's a black seed, a very large, heavy black seed that only has lint coming from the bottom of the seed, the top, and a little seam running in between them. And this makes their processing radically different. Long staple cotton has to be processed on a roller gin. Eli Whitney actually had nothing to do with the development of Sea Island cotton or its production. He invented the saw gin, which was absolutely critical in processing upland cotton, but it actually ruined Sea Island cotton. And the roller gin has been around for millennia. It was developed in South Asia, I believe it was developed in India. And it really has a very simple function. It's just 2 rollers that spin around and it just pulls the lint off. But if you put an upland cotton seed in there, it pulls the seed in through it and crushes the seed. It won't pull the lint off of the seed.
I need to interject something. Yep. Tom built that gin.
Oh.
Not only did I build it, I designed it.
Cool. Yep.
Because there are no WikiHow articles on how to build a roller gin out there.
No YouTube?
Nothing at all. There's a few YouTube videos out there of them building churka gins in India with a guy with a machete and some sticks going like this, but that's about it.
Wow. That's your space.
There
You
you
own
go.
it now.
Yeah. And I'll get more into the gins later. So where was I? But this difference really, they have such a different processing method involved that they're really 2 entirely separate crops. And long staple cotton really only does well in really hot, humid environments, which is why it's perfect in South Carolina, because we are perpetually hot and humid. It actually degrades very quickly. Even in the Midlands, it doesn't do quite as well, because their growing seasons aren't quite as long, and it's just not humid enough for them. There's too many dry spells in between. And it also really likes the sea breeze because it keeps the humidity up. Where is it? And the biggest difference is the length of the lint, and this is not a good example, but the length of the lint on Sea Island cotton is upwards of 1.5 inches in length. The length of this is only 7/8 of an inch. Some cultivars, or some strains developed during the peak of cotton production exceeded 2.5 inches in length. And although this is also incredibly fine as well, it's probably only half the diameter of the strands of upland cotton, maybe only a third, but it is equally as strong. And because of this, you can spin incredibly strong, super fine thread with it, which made Sea Island cotton ideal for weaving women's laces and very fine muslins, as well as industrial applications like fan belts, tire radials, belted radials, parachute cord, thread for sewing together airplane wings, but that was far, far later in their development, which upland cotton just could not handle. It was impossible to spin it fine enough to handle those sort of applications. And that's how the two are different. So now I'm going to get into a little bit of the history of Sea Island cotton. As I stated before, it was developed in about 1790 and was planted extensively throughout the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina. The core of its production in the area where the most cotton was produced of the finest quality was Edisto Island and Johns Island, as well as some of James Island as well. So we're really right at the heart of it. This developed the plantation aristocracy that we know today, and it fueled the slave trade. And Sea Island cotton itself is not to blame, but the greed of man is to blame for driving the slave trade, and really, it was all fixated on this little fluffy white stuff. And eventually that led us down the road to the Civil War, and eventually the abolishment of slavery. And most people only know cotton for its existence in this first half of its life. Sea Island cotton was grown in the United States for 150 years. And the Civil War marked the midpoint of its life, 75 years into its development. After the Civil War, Sea Island cotton was primarily grown by freedmen here on the Sea Islands, and that's really what drove some of them, like Henry Hutchinson, to secure a better future for their families through the growth of Sea Island cotton and selling it to the very same factors in Charleston. Gotta check note card. So I guess that's the cliff notes of it. I won't bore all of y'all. So I'm going to get right into what I've learned about Sea Island cotton through growing this, as someone who knew absolutely nothing about cotton a year ago. Sea Island cotton is not as fickle of a plant as I read it was. However, it is incredibly fickle to get good lint out of it, as you can see by these nasty yellow stained rotten bolls that I have. That is chiefly because of a boron deficiency that I ran into in the middle of growing this. And boron is a very innocuous element that really isn't that important to a lot of plants, but it is critical in their development. Cotton, both upland and Sea Island cotton, are boron sensitive. Sea Island cotton is incredibly boron sensitive. It needs just the right amount in order to produce viable, healthy bolls. Too much and it drops bolls. Too little and it drops bolls. Ever so slightly not enough and it does this. And you don't know it until they start opening. So about 3 weeks after my plants started flowering, they started shedding bolls. Slowly at first, and then very quickly. And after some quick Googling, I realized that was a boron deficiency, which was surprising to me because I had fertilized them for boron because I knew about this.
What is boron?
It is an element.
Is that kind of like what's in borax?
Yes.
It's an ingredient in borax.
That thing you can buy for your household.
Well, actually, roach and ant killer, orthoboric acid, is just boron and water. That's all it is. It's just a molecule of boron and water.
Yeah.
And that's actually what I used to fertilize the plants, because that's the purest form of boron I could get for cheap.
And it's cheap.
Yeah, $2 for a little thing. Do me for the next 5 years.
I think I've got it in the
And I can apply
that's all I
that
can
directly
see.
to the soil or directly to the plants. And that's what I had to do in order to amend this. I had to come through here and spray the foliage of all the plants, and then just like that, all the boron deficiencies went away.
How much did you use per gallon?
I used 1 ounce to treat the entirety of this
1
plot.
ounce of boron?
Just 1 ounce of orthoboric acid, which was only 60% orthoboric acid at that. So really it was only 60% of an ounce of Well, actually, and then that is only 17% boron by weight. So really, it was only like
Tiny amount.
A little bit.
like 5 grams of boron.
Oh,
And it's such a
ain't
minor
much.
element that usually it's present in enough quantities in soil, but it just so happens that sea island cotton is really picky about the amount of boron.
I put azomite down. I used azomite.
And that's some,
Z mineral.
and that's something I'm going to try and do in future is because the reason I ran into that problem is because orthoboric acid is incredibly soluble in water, and I applied it just a little too early, and it all got washed out of the rows before the cotton got big enough to grab it all and keep it. So I'm going to have to try and find a more short release or a more long-term release fertilizer to use in order to supplement that, so I don't have to come back and feed it whenever symptoms start appearing, because that really hurts the productivity. I also learned that sea island cotton is just incredibly hardy. It doesn't have very many pests here in the south anymore with how little it's planted here on the sea islands. I did have an issue with a soil fungus, which was really a cause of the month-long drought we had back in June, which just weakened the plants and allowed it to attack. But it likes to grow. It really likes to grow. And I had almost no damage through Hurricane Dorian. I had 3 plants that just sort of broke over, but as you can, like this one, these 2 here at the front, but they're already coming back up. And I had one that just broke right at the bottom and snapped the taproot, and it just died. But the plants, really, they just sort of tipped over, and that was all that happened to them. Didn't even lose any leaves.
Wow.
And
So you planted these by seeds,
yes, ma'am.
correct? And how many seeds have you planted?
The intent of this was to have 52 plants, and in order to do that, I planted 4 seeds per space. So I planted 208 seeds for the entire plot. And these are 6-foot rows, and the plants are 18 inches apart. And that's another thing I learned. Sea island cotton needs a lot more space than what I gave it. And I was planting it at a very conservative spacing. So it was planted as close as 18 by 5, and it was planted as far as 6 by 2. And I went with 6 by 18 because I thought that's a good middle ground. It'll either be, I would rather it be a little too close than too far apart, because then that'll let weeds in, and then that'll really hurt the plants. And I learned that I can really go with a 6 by 2 just fine, which will mean I'll have less plants, but they'll have far more room, and they'll actually be more productive with how large these are.
You mentioned earlier about the flower. Can I ask you a question? And
Sure.
I might be getting ahead. Okay, you've got the green sticky pods. Then I see right here on that front one the bright yellow. So that one's probably going to open up today, right? The bright yellow that's near the front.
Yeah.
And then you said, and then everything that we're seeing the pink on is what bloomed yesterday.
So I guess I should explain that for the group then. The way sea island cotton flowers, and well, cotton in general flowers, is it first produces a flower bud, which is called a square, which is this little thing right here, which sort of looks like a little torch, a little green torch.
It does.
Here, y'all can pass this around. And then from within there, the flower develops until it looks like this right here. And this is called a candle. And that is when the flower begins to emerge out the top of the bud. And that's how that looks about 12 hours before the flower blooms, up until right before it blooms. Then after that, it's followed by the first day flower, which in upland cotton is called white flower, but in sea island cotton, I guess I'm going to call it yellow flower. And that's the first day flower, and these flowers only last a day. After the first day, they close up and they turn to what you see here, these sort of peachy pink and yellow flowers, and they close up to keep pollinators out, and they sit there for one more day, and on the second day they turn sort of gray, brown, and purple, and then fall off. And then underneath that, the boll matures, and the boll, as I said, looks like a little green egg with a point on the end of it. And that takes 56 days to reach maturity before it opens. So a full 8 weeks, basically 2 months.
Tom, why does it close up to keep the pollinators out?
Well, because it's already been pollinated on the first day. So it closes up so that in the event that it wasn't pollinated, it can crush the male and female portions of the flower together and self-pollinate.
Now, is it wind pollinated or insect?
It's insect and self-pollinated, and the pollinators absolutely love this. I have seen scads of native bees, bumblebees, cuckoo bees, minor bees, leaf bees. I've got at least 5 species of butterfly that have used it. And what else? And I have seen a hummingbird attempt.
I was going to ask that.
He didn't have any luck.
When did you plant these plants?
I planted these on March 21st, and I probably should have planted them on April 1st. But I planted them just a little bit too early, and we had a bit of a cold snap. So I think from now on I'm just going to plant them the first week of April, and that'll be a safe bet.
So all of those pink tap little flowers are in the second day, those will dry up or whatever you said, and fall off. And then in 56 days you'll have a crop? Is that approximately?
Well, actually, everything you see flowering here today will not bear fruit because we're at cutout. So unless we have a miraculous hot winter, this plant will probably get killed by the first frost sometime around the 1st of December. And it'll die back to its roots, and then if we get a hard freeze, it'll totally die. It's very frost intolerant, so it would take an extremely warm winter like we had 2 years ago to keep it alive.
Now if you greenhoused it, if you put
It would.
a temporary greenhouse, would it survive?
Yes, you'd be able to grow it basically like a papaya and stuff. You just have to keep it warm all the time. It is a tropical plant.
Cool.
And so if I had it in a greenhouse, I could grow it into a tree if I really wanted to. But sea island cotton was never designed to be grown as a tree, as a perennial, so that may actually result in it reverting back to its wild type and really running out and no longer producing the quality of lint that it was known for. So I'm going to experiment with these, and I'm going to try and let them regenerate the following year. If we get a hard frost, they'll just die and I'll replant. But if they don't, I want to see if it changes the quality of the lint at all. So I'm going to keep probably 1 row, maybe 2 rows in that event, just to see what it will do. And all of this year's plot was all an experiment. I went at a rather small scale, and I varied what I did on each row to get an idea of what is actually necessary to grow this plant. I did micronutrient fertilization across the entirety of the plant because I knew that was critical regardless. They had to have that or else they weren't going to produce, and they really had to have it. But the first 2 rows I irrigated as seedlings because I didn't know whether or not, because cotton is a dryland plant, but I didn't know how dry of a dryland plant it was. So I irrigated the first 2 rows while they were still seedlings to see how critical that was to getting the plants to establish. And I found out that seedling irrigation did actually matter a significant amount. We had that full month-long drought in June, right at the worst possible time for this plant. And I probably lost about 3/4 of my seedlings to that drought. I actually had to transplant plants from all of the rows to fill all of the gaps back up. And I still had a couple of gaps at the end of it. And in the middle 2 rows, I fertilized with just regular macronutrient, just a 10-10-10 mix, just to see if the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, if what I had available in the soil, because from the soil tests I did, I was really only low in, just a smidge low in phosphorus, and I had perfect amounts of potassium, and I was low on nitrogen. So I figured...
You were low on phosphorus?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Or no, or was I low on potassium? I think I was low on potassium actually, which was odd to me because up in Meggett my house has excessive potassium.
Yeah.
And as you can see by the height of the plants, fertilization, macronutrient fertilization does actually make a difference. And I was able to see with the mortality of the plants that irrigating the seedlings made a very serious difference. So on row 1, I had all of my spaces were maintained. I actually transplanted out 6 plants from row 1 to repopulate row 3, which the first 5 plants all died. And I probably lost, and row 4 is the control. I did absolutely nothing except apply boron, manganese, and sulfate. And I did actually water all rows right there at the end of that drought just because I was because I had an outbreak of a soil fungus, and I was afraid I was going to lose the entire crop if I didn't do something for the control rows. But they did not get watered for the first 2 months of their life. And then, since July, I have not watered any of these plants. So they are just existing off of whatever precipitation they get and soil moisture they can acquire. But I was able to learn that irrigation is critical in the establishment of the seedling, and fertilization actually speeds up the maturation of the plants, because they don't really start blooming until they reach a certain size. It's not really time related. Well, it is in a regard, but the sooner they get to a certain point, the sooner they will bloom. And so the plants here in the middle actually started blooming 3 weeks before the plants on either end.
I have a question.
Yes.
Back then, when it was big time crop, did they know about all this fertilization?
They did and they didn't.
They what?
They did and they did not. They certainly did not irrigate any of their plants ever. They just replanted in May if they looked thin. But they knew about fertilization, but they didn't really understand the chemistry involved. They just knew if they put certain things there that the plants did really well, and if they put too much, they didn't do quite as well. And it was also expensive, so they only wanted to put as much as they had to. And some of the historical fertilizers they used were, say, bird guano shipped in from the Atlantic Islands.
Did they use pluff mud?
And they did use pluff mud. Let's see, they used phosphate from the phosphate mines to supply phosphorus. They used mined potassium and potash to supply the potassium. They added manure for nitrogen. They packed in as much like leaf litter, old hay, cuttings from last year, and marsh grass as they could into the rows. And then at the end of the year, they would move the rows one row over. So they would knock all of the dirt onto the debris they had piled, all the fertilizer and debris they'd piled in the middle of the alleys, and they'd plant on that. And that would allow them to fertilize each row by filling up the alleys and then moving the dirt over. And then they would just move them back the following year. And they did use salt marsh mud, which is how they got all of these micronutrients that you typically don't get from these sources. So by hauling in the mud, they got a lot of potassium, a lot of sulfur, and all of those little tiny micronutrients like magnesium, manganese, chlorine, copper, boron, all of that jazz. They got that from the pluff mud. They didn't know what was in it. They just knew that if they put it on there, the plants look better.
Good, yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that everyone keeps asking me to do, and I'm not going to do because it's very messy and it's very hard.
It's very
And a bag of 10 will last me 10 years and cost $10. But I would like to use more natural systems to supply, say, nitrogen and such, as well as practicing proper nutrient cyclings in order to recycle as much potassium and phosphorus and other micronutrients as I can. And I do plan on recycling the cotton seed from the inferior seeds that I'm not going to use to supply the crop. However, I do need to replenish a lot of micronutrients because there's a lot in these seeds that is not going back in there because I'm harvesting the seeds to continue the crop.
Tell us the story of how you got the original seeds.
I knew I was missing something. So the story of how I got these seeds is there's a lawyer in Charleston, Bill McLean, who read Dr. Richard Porche's book, The Story of Sea Island Cotton, and read the line that sea island cotton is now extinct. It is no longer existent. The stuff that is grown in the Caribbean has back-crossed with the tropical long staple cotton. It is no longer truly sea island cotton, because there is sea island cotton that's grown in the Caribbean, and they do produce a small amount of cotton. They produce luxury dress shirts, basically. And they're very tight-lipped, and they won't let you have any seeds. But that has back-crossed with the original long staple cotton. It's no longer true sea island cotton, because they've been planting it for probably close to 100 years in the Caribbean, because they never suffered from the boll weevil. I totally forgot to mention the boll weevil and all that. I'll get to that in a second. So they've been growing that there for probably 100 years, and it's been running out of the original sea island cotton strains. And that actually, a lot of what's planted in the Caribbean is the same strain as this. It came they tried as hard as they could to secure bleak hull cotton, which is what this strain is. And bleak hull is Botany Bay. So the strain that this is descended from actually originated 2 miles that way. You can almost see it if there wasn't trees. And that's probably the same strain that Henry Hutchinson himself planted, because bleak hull was known for its quality, and Henry was known for producing extremely high quality Sea Island cotton. So, you know, put 2 and 2 together, he can take a boat over there. I would think he would probably be planting bleak hull cotton, because that would be the easiest thing for him to get. And it would be the highest producing that he could grow in this climate. But anyway, back to the seeds. So, after Bill read this line, he said, there's no way that this stuff is gone extinct. It exists somewhere. Somebody's got it in a jar somewhere. And that usually ends up being the case. The same was thought of Carolina Gold Rice and Jimmy Red Corn. And as you know, Carolina Gold Rice you can buy at the store now. And Greg Johnsman has been growing Jimmy Red Corn for many years. And that was the case. It was in a jar somewhere in somebody's house. But that was actually not the case with this. This was even better. So, after the boll weevil arrived, it arrived on Edisto Island in 1918, and the reason that the boll weevil destroyed Sea Island cotton and led to its extirpation from the South was that Sea Island cotton was always a luxury and high-strength industrial product. It filled a very small niche that paid a very high sum for it, because it needed to fill a very, very, very thin role that there was no room for just low-quality cotton in. And upland cotton and Egyptian cotton always took up the slack. When the boll weevil came, what it does is it bores into the side of the boll and it lays an egg. And that egg, its larvae, goes around and it eats the lint around the cotton. And when it does that in Sea Island cotton, it invariably destroys 90% of the boll. 90% of the usable lint gets ruined. When it does that in upland cotton, because it has far more seeds and much smaller lint and more lint per seed, it didn't really hurt upland cotton as much. It like half yields, and it pretty much made it unprofitable, but it was far more resistant to the boll weevil. Sea Island cotton, the market, or the bottom fell out of the entire market. It had already been on a downward spiral for the last 30 years. Some of the larger plantations in the area after the Civil War, they organized an effort to stop selling cotton to Europe in order to try and drive up demand and increase prices, and this backfired extremely hard because Egyptian cotton swooped in and snatched the entire market right underneath their feet. And Egyptian cotton was always known for being inferior to Sea Island cotton. It never produced as much, it never had as much lint per seed, and the lint it did produce was never as fine as Sea Island cotton. It was usually only an inch and a quarter in length. It could never command the price as Sea Island cotton did. But as textile manufacturing improved and we were able to weave stronger and stronger thread from worse and worse cotton, it just seized the entire market. And then the boll weevil came and it was done. But the USDA did not give up. They tried for 24 years to revive Sea Island cotton and develop boll weevil resistant strains. And this was headed in the USDA research station in Florence, South Carolina. And in 1939, after a recent failed attempt to restart the Sea Island cotton industry throughout the interior of Florida, the USDA shuttered the program. And it went to Johns Island for 3 years, where they continued, and throughout all of this, they were maintaining a strain of bleak hull Sea Island cotton for back crossing, a pure strain so that they could back cross upland cotton with it and try and produce minutely hybrid strains of Sea Island cotton that were resistant to the boll weevil. When it went to Johns Island, that shift focused to just purely hybrid strains of upland Sea Island cotton. And then in 1942, the boll weevil quarantine program was developed, and through systematic eradication of boll weevils in specific areas all along the coast, they essentially, what they would do is they would change management practices to really suppress boll weevil growth and explosions, and then quarantine certain areas and limit all production of Sea Island, or all production of any cotton whatsoever, And through this, they managed to totally extirpate the boll weevil from its extent up in Virginia all the way to the Rio Grande Valley. And the boll weevil is no longer extant in the United States, except in the far south corners of Texas, where they are fervently working to keep it there. Which is why I'm able to grow this today, is because the boll weevil no longer exists in South Carolina. And we actually had to buy a permit so that the USDA knows where our sea island cotton, or knows where our cotton is, and they can come out here and place a boll weevil trap if they so choose, in order to monitor for boll weevils to help to quarantine this. And this is done for every cotton field across the United States. It is a massive program. But anyway, when the USDA shuttered their program, right before it left Florence, they sent these seeds to a permanent storage facility in Texas. So these seeds are actually the direct descendants of the USDA's pure Bleak Hall strain that they rigorously and scientifically maintain for genetic stock. And it sat in that vault for 75 years before, just by chance, Bill McLean went onto their website and looked through their seed bank and said, oh, there's Sea Island cotton, and ordered 25 seeds. And they sent it to a lawyer for no reason. He wasn't a horticulturalist, wasn't an extension agent. He had no credentials, and they just sent him 25 seeds.
Okay.
And he planted it actually on Bernie's property at Point of Pines, right down the road. Because he's good friends with Bernie's, they're both lawyers. And from that, it looked like that. And every single thing said, it's Sea Island cotton. And he had the lint measured, had the seeds examined, and nothing said they weren't Sea Island cotton. And then from there, it was planted at McLeod Plantation in 2017. It's no longer planted at Bernie's. And from there, they tried to plant a quarter acre, and they basically killed their volunteers because they were trying to work a quarter acre of cotton with volunteer labor, which I can tell you is not going to work. And so they drastically reduced their program after that. Now they basically have a little sample plot that's about one of my rows long. And from that 2017 batch of seeds, I got my seeds. And that's where these plants are descended. So this is the third generation removed from the USDA seed vault. And everything I have looked at this lint under a microscope. I have examined the seeds with a fine-tooth comb. I have picked over the entirety of the plants looking for anything that looks like they have some hybridization with upland cotton, and I can find nothing at all. Everything says this is pure Sea Island cotton. You know, I am collaborating with somebody who's trying to do a genetic study of this and some other samples of historic samples of Sea Island cotton she can find, and other possibly valuable heirloom strains that are out there in existence, to see how close these are actually related to Sea Island cotton, and if they are in fact pure. But I believe that whether this is pure or not, it is so close to the real thing that it is functionally Sea Island cotton, and it is enough of its genetic stock that I am safe to say as a biologist that this is Sea Island cotton.
Tom, do you know how many places are growing this cotton?
3. There are 3 places in the United States growing Sea Island cotton, period. I have the largest plot in the world.
Yay! Woo!
So McLeod Plantation has had the largest since it was extirpated. They had a quarter acre. I don't know how extensive that was, but this is only 625 square feet. And they had, what's a quarter acre? 10, 12, 11,000 square feet? Which is why they killed their volunteers.
We're only good for so long.
I know there's some descendants of the Seabrook family on Wadmalaw who are growing this, but I don't know how large their plot is. It's probably only a couple of dooryard plants. And McLeod only has maybe a quarter of this now. And they severely reduced that program. They got a lot of backlash over it because their interpretation is of white plantation aristocracy. And so they're planting Sea Island cotton there out in front of the house, and they got a lot of backlash from people because the story they're telling is about white plantation owners, and they're out here planting cotton. But our story is the complete and exact opposite. Our story is how Sea Island cotton brought success to freedmen on Edisto Island after slavery. And Sea Island cotton is core to Henry Hutchinson. And that philosophy is really embodied by Henry. Henry was born in 1860. During the year of secession. He never knew life as a slave, although he was born a slave. In December of 1861, the white population evacuated Edisto Island, and Edisto Island became an entirely black community for at least 2 years, I believe, until the Union came in and started controlling it. The Freedmen Bureau came in, and then eventually the plantation owners came back and got their lands. But the freedmen, like Henry Hutchinson, whose father worked tirelessly to secure land grants for freedmen in the State House, in the courthouse, and also organized large property acquisitions in order to buy land, buy large plantation tracts, and divide them among freedmen so that they had homesteads to produce their food for sustenance, as well as grow Sea Island cotton to generate cold hard cash to actually accrue wealth and pave a better future for their families. And that's what Sea Island cotton represented to Henry Hutchinson. He didn't know it as a slave crop. He knew it as his livelihood, his success. This is what brought him his future and the future for his family. That's what we're interpreting here. And I guess now's a good time to talk about the cotton gins. So I have actually not tested this yet. So I don't know if this is going to work or if it's going to fail miserably. And the reason why I haven't tested it is because I just haven't. It's hard to find Sea Island cotton in the store to test. But the way that this is a double roller gin and this is a hand crank version. The way that this works is that as you turn this, it spins these two rollers. And these strings right here act as a spring, and that pulls this board up and pushes these two rollers together. And it has just enough little give in it that it can pull this lint through it, but it cannot pull the seed through it. And because the seed of Sea Island cotton is very much bare and it does not have a lot of lint on it, it can just peel the lint right off the seed and the seed just falls away and the lint comes right through the other side. If you try this with upland cotton, which I'll try and demonstrate, it just crushes the seed and pulls the whole thing through. Although I did try and test it earlier and it actually worked on one, so I don't really know how that works. But this is what Eli Whitney's invention worked on. The upland cotton, his saw gin, which is basically a comb and a series of teeth. It's a wooden wheel with little slots in it. And if you do that with Sea Island cotton, because the fibers are so fine and long, it rips them in half. And basically what you end up with is very expensive upland cotton that no one wants. So without further ado, we'll see how well this works.
Oh, it left it.
I can see it. It looks like it left the seed.
Now we'll try that with upland cotton, and I think I might break the gin doing that. But I specifically built this gin to donate to the Edisto Island Open Land Trust so that they can use it for demonstrations and break it.
You know you need to put a patent on it.
Well, actually, there are patents, and they're all like 200 years expired.
All right, let's see.
Yeah, there goes the gin.
Yeah. Okay. No, never mind. Okay.
Yeah, and so that's why you can't gin upland cotton on a roller gin, and which is why Eli Whitney's invention was so pivotal in the production and expansion of the upland cotton crop throughout the Midlands. Before that, upland cotton was a totally unproductive, useless crop because you couldn't gin it. You could get this, but you'd have to sit there by hand and pick the seeds out. Whereas upland cotton was far more productive at this time because you could just... I already pulled that off. You could just run it. Okay, I have broken the gin, so.
Oh no. Oh no.
But this one likes to break, so it's made of scrap wood. It's not, tolerances aren't as tight. I actually have 4 of these. All of them look different. And right here, I actually have an instruction manual on how to build one of these, except it won't have the gears and it'll have 2 handles.
Can't wait to go home and make mine. I'm teasing.
You can build it for less than $20. It's a 6-foot 2x4 and a 4-foot 1 1/4 inch dowel and a box of screws. That's all it is. Oh, and a piece of string and a nail.
Lucky you're the only one who has the cotton for it. So
right, yeah.
Tom, you make Clemson proud. You do.
Well, actually, y'all should see my full-size treadle-powered one with gears and pulleys and fan belts that I've built on top of an old Singer sewing machine. Which is far more impressive, but it also weighs like 100 pounds, which is why it's not here today.
But you are going to bring it to the office, right?
Eventually, hopefully.
Wait a minute,
Upland cotton, what they use is a harvest aid. They basically plant all of the cotton and they just let it grow, and they don't pick any of it. And these newer strains of upland cotton, because upland cotton is such a, it's got a much stouter fiber. It's really resistant to the elements, and so they just let it grow all season, and then mid-September, once they reach cutout, which is the point where they're not going to produce nothing no flower is going to produce before the first cold snap, they come through and they spray a harvest aid, which is just an herbicide that kills the plant down to its roots. And they let it sit for about a month, and they let the plant totally dry out, and then they come through with mechanical pickers, which are basically like two giant dog lint rollers that go down the sides of the rows and just rip all of the cotton out of the bowls. And they pack that into big bales and drop it in the field, and then they take that to market. And you can't do that with Sea Island cotton because the bowls are so much smaller, and they have these little wings that stick out, and they get in the way of the machinery, and they're also 6+ feet tall.
Yeah.
May I pass this around?
Yes. And because the fibers are so much finer, they rot in the bowl a lot faster. You really have to be on top of this stuff and pick it if you want high quality lint for high quality applications. And so Sea Island cotton really requires manual picking.
So you pick it roughly 60 days after the flower?
Yes. And then it goes like that for the entire time that it hasn't froze. So usually what would happen is the flowers would start blooming in early June. Mine didn't bloom until July because of the drought. So they basically lost a month because they didn't get any water for a month. And then you get your first bulls at the end of August, usually around Labor Day. Well, actually, it's usually in the middle of August, and I think my first bull open was the first week of September, but it was an immature bull that was underdeveloped. I didn't get my first full bull until the following week. And then they will continue to open until the first frost, and then then there's still a few bulls on the plants that will continue to dry and open after that point, but anything that was underdeveloped at that point will stay underdeveloped. It will never mature past that point because the plant's dead. So it can no longer be fed and grown.
Is that is that a dead flower by chance?
Yeah, it does.
Well, cotton as well as okra and hibiscus are all members of the mallow family. And so I've actually had quite a few people come out here and they come over here and they go,
Let me see it.
why are you planting okra out here?
Yeah.
Some old cultivars too,
Well, and then on the other hand, Junior down there on the corner of Indigo Hill Road, he had a big plot of okra out there. And then someone came in and they said, hey, there's a guy in the corner growing Sea Island cotton. Of the bracts of the flower, those are actually gossypal glands, and these produce a toxic, foul-tasting chemical that's actually poisonous to mammals, insects, and birds.
You tell us that after we've handled it.
Well, it won't kill you. It's one of those things where you'd have to go and eat like a salad made of this, and then it would just make you sick. It wouldn't kill you.
So the fencing, what are you protecting?
So the trick though is that deer are ruminants, and ruminants, as you know, have 4 stomachs. And the way their weird, crazy digestive system works is they actually don't absorb anything through their stomachs. So they have this weird thing where the food goes into the first chamber of their stomach and then the second, and then it gets processed bacteria, and then they burp it up, and then they inhale volatile hydrocarbons, then they inhale volatile hydrocarbons through their lungs, and then they absorb it that way. And it's weird, it's crazy. Go look it up. So they actually the toxin doesn't get into their bloodstream because it is totally destroyed by their stomach, and they don't actually absorb anything through their stomach. I'm sure they do through their small intestine, but by the time it gets through their 4 stomachs, it's totally destroyed. And so they're actually not affected by it. However, it tastes terrible.
Well, you know, they also rub their